And hello, friends. Welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the television show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Eliot Parker. It's great to have you with us. Today on Chapters, we're going to be talking about fiction and multicultural literature, and we have a wonderful author with her debut novel here today to talk to us about those issues, and that is Rajia Hassib. And she was born and raised in Egypt, and she moved to the United States when she was 23. She holds an MA in creative writing from Marshall University. Her short fiction has appeared in Upstreet, Steam Ticket, and Border Crossing magazines, and she lives in West Virginia with her husband and her 2 children. And we're here to talk to her today about her debut novel, In the Language of Miracles. And so, Rajia Hassib, welcome to Chapters. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No, my pleasure. So tell us a little bit about this book. Give us an overview of the plot of this book. What happens in The Language of Miracles?
The book is about an Egyptian family who has been living in the U.S. For decades and whose oldest son commits an unforgivable crime. And as a result of that crime, he and the neighbor's daughter end up dead. So the book picks up a year after both deaths, and it examines what happens to the family and how the community reacts to that as the community is preparing for a memorial service for the slain girl. And the boy's father decides to take his family and to attend. And he thinks it's a good idea to go and offer his condolences and to express the apologies. And that kind of starts a series of events in motion where he and his wife and remaining children try to understand what happened and deal with their revised role in the community now.
One of the things that's so unique about your book is you have this great plot and these wonderfully developed characters, some of whom we'll talk about here in just a minute. But where did the inspiration for your story come from? Is this loosely based on something that you experienced or something you heard about secondhand? Where does sort of the inspiration for your plot come from?
It's not based on something that I personally experienced per se, but it is based on my experience living in the U.S. after 9/11. I moved to the U.S. in 98, so just a few years before the attacks of 9/11, and I witnessed this shift in perspective that people had about Muslims and Arabs in general. And for years afterwards, there was this huge debate about what should Muslims do. And people were complaining, well, you guys are not doing enough. You're not apologizing. You're not making it clear that you oppose such acts of terrorism. And then in 2010, I don't know if you remember the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, where there was a plan to build this huge cultural center in New York City, very close to Ground Zero. And the idea was to open up kind of a pathway for dialogue, for interfaith dialogue, and to embrace different religions in that cultural center. But there was a huge backlash and opposition. And people just felt offended by it. They said, you can't come this close, we're never going to forget what happened, and we just don't want an Islamic center that close to Ground Zero. And that kind of got me thinking about the whole idea of apology. How can you apologize for something so horrendous? And how can you accept people to kind of forgive you, even if you didn't actually do the deed? And that was what bothered me the most. What am I expected to do? What are other American Muslims expected to do to kind of try to right this wrong, or is there even a way to do so? So I thought a good way to address that in fiction is to try and create a microcosm for the events of 9/11. So rather than addressing the politics, I thought, okay, I'm going to create this one single family whose one son created this horrendous or committed a crime, and where this family is now trying to deal with the aftermath of his crime. And I thought creating this microcosm for 9/11 would allow me to explore what it feels like to be a Muslim living in the United States post 9/11 without getting into the politics of the events, which I wasn't interested in.
Sure, absolutely. I wanted to ask you too, one of the things that's interesting with the narrative and how you start the novel, it sets up 1 year after the tragedy that you're talking about that the son commits. Why was one of the reasons you wanted to start a year after instead of starting, with the event itself?
Well, I wanted, for several reasons. The main reason was I wanted to make it clear that my focus was not the event itself, but rather the aftermath of the event. How do you deal with something like that once it's happened? And especially when it's something that you didn't see coming at all, like the family did, and that you are now forced to deal with, even though you had nothing to do with it. So one reason was that focus, because had I started it with the event itself, I would have had to focus on what happened. I would have had to focus more on the character of the son who committed those crimes, and he wasn't my main interest. I didn't want the novel to end up being about him. I wanted it to be about his family. Another reason was that I needed to create enough emotional distance for the family to be able to deal with the community and the ultimate rejection that they're facing from that community. And I thought, had I set the novel just after the events, the grief and the shock would have had to take center stage. Whereas if you wait a little bit and you go a year later, the grief is still there and I can still handle it and address it, but then there is some room for clarity of vision where they can perhaps start to think, okay, so what do we do now?
We meet several characters who take us through this experience and the plot that you're talking about. There seems to be a theme of healing in this story, and everybody heals differently and is healing in some ways differently through this experience. Those that have healing and those that experience healing as the story goes on. Did you find in writing the novel and writing the characters, did you want different characters to experience that idea of healing differently, or was it something that by the end of the novel you wanted to say, okay, everybody has experienced healing this way? How did that come about in terms of applying that theme of healing to your characters and to your story?
I think that developed as I was writing the story. I knew that the characters would not be dealing with healing in the same way, but I wasn't sure how those differences will actually end up being articulated in the novel. So one of the things that I worked on through the several drafts of this novel was character development, obviously, but particularly how the differences in background for the various family members will affect the way they deal with the situation, whether it's dealing with grief or dealing with healing or trying to do something to reach that stage of healing, hopefully. So the focus on the different pathways kind of developed as I was working on that, and as a kind of a byproduct of character development, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly does. Very, very good. Very interesting. One character who stands out to me, and I wanted to ask you about her, is Natalie Bradstreet. We meet her about a third of the way through the book. Tell us a little bit about her and what her importance is in the novel.
For me, she symbolizes a sort of innocence that gets kind of plucked away. And I specifically chose the name Bradstreet in reference to Anne Bradstreet because I thought, okay, for some reason, just knowing that Anne Bradstreet's history and being the first published poet back in 1650 with the 10th Muse and all of that, back in the time of the Puritans, and I liked her so much in terms of a character and what she did, and I thought if I named the main character after one of the main characters after her, that would help somehow underscore the fact that this is an important figure. It's a promising figure, and this promise has been cut short. So it was important to me that the person who falls victim to that crime is a person that people will sympathize with, and it's a person that is ultimately innocent. And so her importance stemmed from that. And of course, some of the gender issues play in that as well. That's why she had to be female, because it kind of helps people empathize a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, and she's an interesting character, too, because how she approaches the other characters. She treats them in many ways just like people. I mean, she doesn't really seem to have a lot of negative or apprehensive or
she's young.
Poisonous views,
Yes.
that maybe you would get from an older character.
Yes.
And is that part of her makeup, too? Is that what you think makes her such a good character? She's got that innocence, and that's such an interesting story about the Bradstreet connection, about the Anne Bradstreet connection. But she is she almost reminds me of sort of a voice of reason sort of character. We see things through her prism and through what she experiences as if there were no, prejudices or no biases. She approaches people just as they are.
Yes. I think that's part. It's part of her age, and it's part of character. But she's in high school, so she's a young character, and I think that's part of the innocence too. And it kind of unfortunately helps set her up a little bit too to become a victim. So she has her kind of little charm, even though she doesn't take up much of the novel space-wise, but she's always there, obviously.
So yeah, she's a fantastic character. I wanted to know too about your process for writing this. When did you start? From the time you had this idea that you wanted to do this, what was your timeline for writing the story? How long did it take? What was the writing and revision process like? Take us through that process of from idea conception until you had a manuscript or a draft ready to go.
Well, I was actually on a deadline with this novel because the idea started during my last. I went back to Marshall University and got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree back to back. So during my last term, getting my bachelor's degree, the idea started as an idea for a short story. I was doing an independent study with the chair of the English department at Marshall University, Dr. Jane Hill, who ended up being my mentor and a great friend. And I pitched this idea to her. I thought, I want to do this. And she listened and she said, well, that's great, but that's not a short story, that's a novel. And I thought, okay, that is a novel. That's wonderful because it opens up all these possibilities when you start thinking about a single idea as in terms of a novel. So the following semester, I started with my master's degree, and I knew I was going to write a creative thesis, and I wanted to write this novel. So I had 2 years to write it from start to finish. I had the wonderful opportunity to work with Marie Manella, who is, of course, I'm sure you know her. She's a wonderful author, generous person, was a Huntington native. And she was on my thesis committee, so I got to meet with her once a week for 1 year to work on that novel. And I knew that was like my chance, right? If you get to work with someone who is such a great writer and such a generous person and a good teacher as well, then I just had to take advantage of that. So when I started meeting with her, I started with one chapter when I met with her, and by the end of our kind of weekly meetings, 1 year later, I had a draft. I was kind of halfway through my second draft because I met with her every week. I gave her 10 to 15 pages of writing. She commented on them. She gave me advice, and then I would revise those and go on. And once that was done, I revised the whole thing. So if we're talking about process, I think my main process is the revision process. It's not really, that's one thing I learned. Yeah. The first draft is something that I just had to generate in order to have material to work with, and in order to know what it is exactly that I'm talking about even. And the idea obviously develops through the first draft, and I kind of ended up learning about what I wanted to say as I wrote this first draft. And then once that was done, I had to revise it. And I ended up revising the novel maybe 4 times, at least, with chapter revisions kind of added to that. So by the end of the 2 years, I had a draft that I presented as my master's thesis, and then I took another 6 months after that to revise that one more time before I started submitting it for publication.
So this indeed was a process from the time you started to the time it was ready to go.
It was, yes, it was.
Did you find that having written short stories and had short stories published was good practice for you in writing this novel?
Yes, I think it is. It's essential on many levels. It's good practice in terms of learning the importance of trying to get your writing as clean and as tight as possible. If I was to take this seriously, and if I'm really trying to get published, which is what I was doing at the time, then writing short stories is the best place to start, because you learn that this is a very competitive field. People will not take a second glance at your work if it's obviously sloppy. So writing short stories was one way to learn that and to know, okay, I need to revise this, I need to make it as airtight as I can possibly make it before I actually hope to expect any results. And it's also good to give you some credibility, because once you start trying to find someone to publish it, is always a good thing to know, to say, I've already been published in this and this and that literary magazine, and then they know to take you a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, they're going to look at that like they would references on a resume. They're
Exactly.
going to see where have you been published and what have you done and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Excellent advice. I wanted to ask you, too, about another character in your book, In the Language of Miracles, and Asan,
Yes.
who arrives from Egypt in the story, comes in with incense, comes in with prayers, comes in with this determination to stop what she is seeing happening to the family. Tell us a little bit about Asan, the character, and what happens when Asan arrives, and what does Asan do to the family?
She's the grandmother, and she's one of my favorite characters. So I'm glad you're asking about her. She's been described as by people I know as kind of like the glue that keeps the family together. She is here because she knows her daughter has gone through this horrible time. She knows her daughter's family is suffering, and she is here to bring healing, as you talked earlier about healing as a theme in the novel. So she is here to help. And the wonderful thing about her, I think, is that she is just a very generous person. And to me, she's almost like the archetype of mothers and grandmothers in general. Her main goal is to come here and see, okay, what can I do to help this family heal? And of course, the interesting thing is that she has really no resources to do much. All she can do is, as you said, she's very superstitious. She brings incense. She thinks that if she kind of twirls incense around the house, that all the evil, spirits will go away. She thinks that they've been victims of the evil eye, so she needs to protect them and pray and kind of hang blue things around the house to make sure that they're protected. So the means that she uses mostly are like superstitious things, which kind of makes her, I think, a little bit more endearing, because you feel how helpless she is, and yet she is such a force that somehow what she does works to a certain extent, at least.
Sure, absolutely. And Khaled, who's another character in your book that I really liked, kind of sees two paths to life through her.
Yes.
He sees that he can either redeem himself and in some case get an element of salvation through her,
Yes.
through watching her and talking to her and seeing what she does, or he looks at her sometimes and could take the other way and just get totally away from the family, get totally away from the experience, the tragedy that you talk about at the beginning of the novel. So it's interesting how at times he sees one aspect of her and what she is, and then the other times looks at her and says, maybe this is my ticket out of here. It's really interesting how he views her. Sometimes in both ways in the same chapter, sees her one way, on one page, and then 2 pages later sees her in a different way.
Exactly. But I think his struggles are typical of anyone with a hyphenated identity, right? He was born and raised in Egypt, in the United States, and she was born and raised in Egypt, and she's she's his grandma, and she brings all these traditions with her that he doesn't really identify with, but that are part of his heritage, whether he likes it or not. And he's a young kid. He's in high school as well, so he's kind of going back and forth all the time between, this is just like insane stuff, I don't really think the incense is going to do anything, and between feeling that really what's behind what she does is this tremendous love. And I think this is the one thing that makes her so irresistible to him, because he knows that she loves him unconditionally and that she loves this whole family. So it makes it a little bit difficult for him to totally reject what she does and what she brings, even if he is not really kind of convinced that whatever she thinks will bring healing is the way to do it.
Yeah. So. Excellent, very good. One of the characteristics of this novel that makes it so terrific is just beautiful writing. There's just such beautiful prose in here. But I did want to ask you, you had such a good idea for what you wanted out of the book and where you were headed, and you talked to us a minute ago about the process. As you think back to the book and you think about the process that you undertook, what was challenging about putting this type of a novel together?
Many challenges. Where do I start? I think the main challenge for me was that this was my first novel. So the idea of a novel itself is really overwhelming if you think about it. Perhaps the most challenging part was deciding what to include and what to exclude. I wrote a lot more than the 288 pages you have here. I have half a shelf back home of just drafts of this novel. So it's always difficult to decide what goes in and what needs to be discarded, especially if you write something and you kind of like it and you think, oh, that's nice, that's a nice piece of writing, and then you're like, oh, that doesn't work. I can't use that. And that's one thing that I learned from Marie Manella. It's the process of pretty much ruthless editing and revision. If it's not helpful to the novel as a whole, it doesn't belong there. So the challenge was perhaps to decide what to focus on, what not to focus on. It was also very challenging to have a family of Muslim Americans as protagonists, and to hope that the reader will at least understand their background, understand where they're coming from, and perhaps even empathize with them. Even though I know that Muslims are not exactly the most popular, people around in the U.S. right now, unfortunately. So it was also a challenge to kind of try to tread delicately in these areas. How do I present these people in a way that doesn't make them seem like, oh, I'm totally victimizing them, they're so innocent and people just don't like them, which I did not want to do at all, and which is not true, I think. And at the same time, how to kind of hope that the readers will identify with them a little bit. So.
And I know we were talking a little bit before we started taping the interview. You still have family that live in Egypt.
Yes.
Do you get to see them often? Do they come here often? And can you give us a sense of, I know that those of us that have been following the news, we know there's been some tumult in Egypt the last 5 or 6 years with President Mubarak being removed, and then
Yes.
President Sisi and the Muslim Brotherhood, and him being overthrown by, President Morsi being overthrown by the military general, President Sisi, who's now there now. Can you give us a sense of, or tell us how your family's doing? Do they get to see you? And what is the state of things in Egypt right now as you know it?
Okay. Well, my family, all my family is back in Egypt. I came over with my husband in '98, so my family and his family are still back there. They're doing well. They're kind of learned to live with the turmoil. They come to visit more often. I haven't been back in Egypt for maybe 13 years, but I've always had, like, my parents used to come to visit all the time. My dad still does. We FaceTime all the time, which is a wonderful invention. So technology helps. Back when I first came in '98, I used to have to buy these little kind of phone cards, where you can only talk for 10 minutes, and it was so complicated. And so it's nice to be able to FaceTime now. Egypt is kind of, it's still not politically as secure as it used to be, or as I would like to see it, unfortunately. I think that's understandable, considering all the events since 2011. It's been, so much has gone on, and so many changes of regime, and it's just, after a revolution like what happened in 2011, things can go in any direction, and for a long time it wasn't really obvious where they would go, and I would argue that it's still kind of not totally clear where things are going. But the interesting part is that people seem to adapt easily. So when I talk to my father or to my sister, they're like, "Oh, it's okay. They're living their lives.
Good.
So they're doing well, thank God."
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So, in our closing moments here, Rajia, I want to ask you. You've got this book out. It's getting fantastic reviews. Library Journal, Goodreads, all kinds of publications are talking about this book, and deservedly so. So what are you working on next, or what's in the pipeline? What's in the thought stages for your next novel?
I'm working on another novel, actually, and the new one is set partly in Egypt and partly in the United States. It is in the post-2011 Egypt, so it does have a lot to do with the political turmoil that's been going on there. And it follows the paths of 3 different characters as their lives kind of intertwine and finally merge toward the end. So it's different from this one, but it's kind of has some of the same themes and some other themes added to them, and it's just like, I'm really enjoying writing it, and I hope it will turn out well.
Well, I can tell you one thing. If it's half as good as this, you're going to have another great novel on your hands.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So in my final question and our final moments, Rajia, if someone in our audience wants to get in contact with you to talk about the book or talk to you about writing, or wants to get a copy of your novel in the language of miracles, how can they get in contact with you? Where can they get a copy of your book?
I'd love to hear from anyone. I would love to get in contact. I have a website. It's rajiahassib.com. It has my contact information. You can contact me via email there. I'm on Twitter. Again, it's at Rajia Hassib. I also have a Facebook page, so I'm kind of on social media everywhere. If you just Google my name, or if you just Google the title of the novel in the language of miracles, which is easier to remember than my name, then you should be able to get to my website and then go from there. The novel should be available at all local bookstores. I know Empire has it now. Taylor Books will have it in Charleston. It's available on different outlets on the internet as well, Amazon and so forth. So I hope people kind of enjoy it, and I hope they read it, and I hope they reach out and talk to me and tell me what they think.
Rajia Hassib, the author of In the Language of Miracles, a wonderful novel of religion, of prayer, of parents, of grandparents, of healing, of redemption, so many great themes, so many great characters, a wonderful novel, her debut collection, In the Language of Miracles. Thanks so much for coming on to Chapters.
Thank you
Congratulations
so much.
again. What a wonderful book, and I appreciate you coming down to talk to us about it today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Sure, my pleasure. And we want to take a moment to say thanks to the staff and management of Empire News and Books and News here at Pullman Square in Huntington for providing our studio taping space today. We encourage you to come by Empire Books and News and pick up a copy of Rajia's book or any other book that you've seen featured on our Chapters program from any author, publisher, or editor that we featured. They have their works for sale here at Empire Books and News, so we encourage you to stop by and check them out. And we appreciate their sponsorship each and every episode here on Chapters. And if you'd like to reach out to us here on the show, we've made that possible to you through email, and our email address is right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We appreciate all the comments and feedback that we get about the program, so please keep those coming. And if you want to go back and watch a previous episode of Chapters, maybe that you've missed along the way or that you want to go back and see for a second time, we've made that available to you through YouTube. We have an Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube where you can find all of our previous Chapters episodes, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen as well. It's www.youtube.com/Armstrong One Wire. From there, go to the Chapters tab, and you can find all the previous episodes of Chapters. We have over 50 episodes and counting, so we encourage you to go back and take a look at those. And some of you have done that and left comments in the comments fields about the programming, and we appreciate that so much. But if you want to go back and take a look at another episode or an older episode of Chapters, that's where you can find it there on YouTube. And that will do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.